So my name is Elle. I'm PAVE's Director of Content. I use she, her pronouns. I've been with PAVE for 3 years now, and we're super excited tonight because we have Emma Grasso-Levine from Know Your 9. As you probably know, Know Your 9 is a youth and survivor-led project of advocates for youth intended to empower students to end gender-based and sexual violence in their schools. Um, we were lucky enough to have Emma at our summit about 2 weeks ago, our Shadow the Red Zone summit, where we kind of talked more about like the basics of Title IX. And today we're going really more into the new updates that went into effect in a lot of places around the US August 1st. But if you want to learn more about kind of the basics and some of the other topics we talked about at the summit, I will be putting the link to watch it in the chat so you can go and check it out after this. So without further ado, I'm just going to stop talking and hand it over to Emma.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elle, and thank you so much to PAVE for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. And to all of you who are attending, thank you so much for being here as well. Really appreciate you taking the time to spend your evening with us. So let me just take a moment to share my screen with you all, and then we'll jump into things. Go. Awesome. So as Elle said, my name is Emma. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I'm the Senior Manager of Title IX Policy and Programs at Advocates for Youth. And in that role, I manage Know Your 9, which, as Elle said, is a project of Advocates for Youth that works to empower students to end sexual and dating violence in schools. And I've been in this role for about 3 years now. And just a little fun fact about me, before jumping into this program manager and policy manager role, I was also a youth activist on my campus doing Title IX policy advocacy and organizing. So very much bring that background to this work that I do now. And there's my email there. We'll have time for questions at the end, but definitely feel free to shoot me an email if you want to get in touch more or have additional questions that we don't have time to get to on tonight's webinar. So yeah, as I said, Know Your 9 is a project of Advocates for Youth. We operate at both the K-12 and college level, and we operate by supporting and training students to hold their institutions accountable regarding addressing sexual assault and gender violence. And we operate at several different levels. We mobilize on the local level, so supporting students who are doing organizing and activism in their local communities around sexual violence and gender violence. Also have worked previously on state legislative efforts to support and protect student survivors. And then, and this is where we're really going to be focusing and honing in on tonight, doing federal policy work. So things like Title IX is one of our main focuses, as you can probably tell from our name, Know Your 9. And really the goal there is to create a more equitable education system for all folks, but especially centering student survivors. So before I actually jump into content, and you all can take a look at the screen there and see sort of like what the actual statute of Title IX is, but I do want to just acknowledge that we will be talking about sexual harassment and violence and discrimination tonight. And so really encourage folks to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. If that looks like taking a break, go getting a glass of water, taking a walk around, tapping out for a little bit, that is totally fine. I will not be offended. Top priority is definitely making sure folks feel good and safe and emotionally okay. So definitely encourage folks to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves while we're moving through content. And then also definitely feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. I will do my best, if there's things that are relevant to what we're currently talking about, to answer them as we go along, but we'll also definitely have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A portion for you to ask any and all questions that you might have of me about Title IX. Okay, so with that sort of, groundwork laid down and established, what is Title IX, right? Some of you may be coming to this space as advocates, some of you may be coming to this space as students, and I know folks, there's been a lot about Title IX in the news, as you all may have seen, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what Title IX is. A fun fact is that the actual statute of Title IX, which has been around for over 50 years now, is actually only 37 words long. And so these 37 words are on the screen. I think the key thing to highlight is the "on the basis of sex" phrase, and also the fact that Title IX applies to any institution, educational program receiving federal funds, right? And we've started to see this, and I'll actually get into this on this next slide here. We, see Know Your 9 as a federal, or Title IX, excuse me, as a federal civil rights law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. And to even expand on that, right, to take sort of that more legal language and turn it into something that actually means something in terms of students' rights, school staff and admins' rights, who are also protected by Title IX. It also includes the right to an education free from violence. and with protection from retaliation, and also with access to accommodations. And I'll get into that a little bit more in terms of what that actually looks like, but just keep that in mind throughout our time together tonight. It also applies to K-12 schools and colleges, both, that receive federal funding. And we've actually started to see it apply to some private or independent schools too that historically have not been covered under Title IX. And this really started in the pandemic when schools were receiving small assistance grants, right, to sort of keep them afloat, to, make it easier for them to adapt to different learning modes in the pandemic. And so as soon as a school receives a cent, literally, of federal funding, that also means that they are legally obligated to comply, with Title IX rules. So that's just something to keep in mind for you all as you're taking this knowledge, which is the goal of this presentation, right? Is for you all to learn a lot tonight and then take it all back to your local communities and advocacy you might all be doing on your own. And so it's also really helpful to know, like, whether a school in your community, whether you're a student, the school you go to, or a parent, the kid that your the school that your kid goes to, or an advocate or school staff, whether what your Title IX status is at your school, right? And then, and the other thing to highlight about Title IX is that it really promotes equity in all aspects of education. And by that, we mean academics, athletics. Some folks, that is often their entry point into Title IX because Title IX has evolved a lot over the years that it's existed. And so many folks' entry point into the world of Title IX is hearing about it in terms of equity in sports, right? It's making sure that, kids, boys sports teams and girls sports teams have equal access to resources, equipment, funding, things like that. So that is definitely also one part of Title IX, but less of what we're going to be focusing on tonight. We're more so going to be focusing on it in terms of sexual violence and harassment, which, as Title IX has evolved over the years, has become a really core piece of what Title IX addresses as well. And as I've said before, but I'm going to reiterate it just because I think it's helpful sometimes to hear things multiple times. I know that's true for me. Title IX applies to any educational programs or activities affiliated with the school. So if something happens on a field trip, if someone is doing work study, right, and that's sponsored by the school, things like that, Title IX also applies to those environments. So to dig into it even more, we're just going to keep digging deeper and deeper tonight together. Who does Title IX protect, right? So we know that it applies to all students, right? But there's certain categories of folks that it mentions explicitly and has covered historically throughout Title IX's existence. So as I mentioned, student athletes, that's a big one. Pregnant and parenting students as well are explicitly covered under Title IX, as well as LGBTQ students. Students seeking access to abortion care, which that has always been true, but it was clarified, especially with the Biden administration's new rules, as Al mentioned a little bit earlier, and we're going to really dive into what that looks like later. And then lastly, of course, it protects student survivors. And that means, survivors of sexual harassment, violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, stalking, things like that. And so some of you may already know this or feel like I'm totally on board with why we need Title IX, but just to make sure we are on the same page, we need Title IX because we know that survivors of sexual violence need support, right? And the hope in terms of what I hope is our collective vision, right, for a world free from sexual violence and harassment, we want to make sure that there's as many tools in the toolbox for survivors as possible. And so Title IX is a civil rights approach, a civil rights tool in the toolbox to be able to support survivors, given just how prevalent and how much of an epidemic sexual violence is in schools. So just to set the scene a little bit, we have data that from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey that shows that nearly 1 in 5 teen girls experienced sexual violence in the past year. This is actually last year, which has been a significant increase from 2017 when that survey was last conducted. More than 1 in 10 girls reported experience being forced to have sex, and nearly 1 in 4 LGBTQ students experience sexual violence. So those are pretty hefty statistics, and definitely just underscores the way that even with all the tools and the solutions that we have currently and have had for a while, there's a lot more work left to be done, right? And just to expand on this further, KnowYourIX did a report a couple years back. It's called The Cost of Reporting. If you can find it on our website, which is knowyour9.org. And we surveyed survivors and to learn more about what their experience was reporting violence in their schools. And we talked to folks both at the K-12 level and also at the college level. And some of the things that we found include that nearly 40% of survivors who report to their school will be pushed out of education. And this is because of their experiences after reporting violence to their school, right? We found that 10% will drop out of school, 70% of survivors who report violence and harassment say that the process jeopardized their safety or privacy in some way. And then 15% of survivors are punished or threatened with punishment by their school for reporting. And I know I mentioned retaliation earlier, right, when talking about what Title IX protects folks from. And so we really saw a strong trend of survivors experiencing retaliation after reporting violence. And to frame these statistics, I also just want to underscore that these statistics, these experiences that folks had, negative experiences that folks had, were not only the result of the actual act of violence or harassment or discrimination that folks experienced, but we also heard time and time again in our conversations with survivors that it was almost worse to experience than the betrayal or the lack of response from their school after reporting said violence or harassment, discrimination. So we really saw a direct correlation between schools' ability to respond and folks having to have major interruptions in their educational experiences as survivors. And so just to talk a little bit more about what those educational interruptions are, it can look like having to take a leave of absence, as I mentioned a second ago, have to switch schools altogether, something we've heard from folks. It can also have a really negative impact on mental health. And sort of a part of that can also be social isolation or loss of community, especially if retaliation is going on after a student has reported violence. Financial consequences, as well, are a big one. We hear from students who, for example, maybe started at college, took out student loans to earn that degree that they really were excited about, then had an experience of violence and either had to take a leave of absence that then jeopardized scholarships or, other awards that they got that require them to be like a full-time student constantly, or having to drop out entirely and then having student loans for a degree that they would never complete, right? And so that's a really big one that I think folks don't talk about often enough, but is definitely something to keep in mind as we're thinking about the really lifelong impacts, right, of sexual violence and what it can have for students. And then lastly, a chilling effect on reporting. This one is especially connected to if a school is not responding effectively. We've heard, and we'll talk about this more, but especially in the last 4 years where students have been, we have definitely heard that, students, they talk to each other, right? They share their experiences as they should about, hey, I went through this experience of assault or harassment, and the school really didn't do enough for me, or I was really harmed by the school in this way. And so that can also really deter other folks from reporting if they feel like they can't trust their school to show up for them and give them the support that they need. I'm just going to quickly check the chat. I think some of this will be great to talk about in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Definitely keep those questions coming. I appreciate you all. And so I know, I'm just gonna get to the end of this slide here. I know that a lot of folks also talk about, I was talking a little bit earlier about tools in the toolbox, right? Wanting to make sure that folks have tools in the toolbox to be able to get the justice and healing that they seek after experiencing violence and harassment. And so I just want to also highlight that Title IX can sometimes be the only option for folks when they are seeking those resources and support that they need to be able to stay in school and achieve those educational dreams, right, that we all have. And something also to note is just that sometimes schools can meet needs in a way that the criminal legal system can't always for students. For example, if a student reports to law enforcement and a criminal case is opened, they aren't necessarily going to really quickly be able to offer a student academic extensions because they're having trouble keeping up with work because their mental health is really impacted by this experience of assault, for example, right? Also, we know that a lot of times folks have negative experiences with the criminal legal system. So we have research that shows that LGBTQ folks disproportionately feel uncomfortable asking the police for help often. And also LGBTQ folks who interact with law enforcement also have had experiences with mistreatment that can look like violence or harassment in addition to what they've already experienced. We also know that sometimes folks who have experienced racism in experiences with police also don't feel like that's an option for them. And so for students who have some of those different experiences, being able to have a functional and supportive Title IX system can really make or break their ability to be able to continue to stay in school and get the support that they need. So now that I've given you all a little bit of a background on why we need Title IX, sort of where we are in terms of the landscape of sexual violence in education, and sort of done a little bit of a compare and contrast between Title IX and other sort of tools in the toolbox to address this issue, I do also want to give you all a chance to just sort of get a sense of like how long Title IX has been around and how it's evolved over the years, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's been around over 50 years at this point. Its 50th anniversary was in 2022. And while that it has been around for a long time, it really hasn't been, as I said, it's evolved a lot. And it wasn't really until 2011, under the Obama administration, that we saw Title IX really explicitly make it clear to schools what their obligations were to be in compliance with Title IX and to address sexual harassment and violence in schools. And so some of you may have heard of the Dear Colleague letter that was sent from Obama administration officials to schools, really clarifying those requirements, right? Then in 2020, under the Trump administration, we saw a lot of those protections that had been established get really rolled back and undermined with new rules that really, undermined survivors' rights, ability to have a fair process, and also, there's been a lot of digging that has gone into how the drafting of those rules went, and a lot of evidence that's come out that showed that anti-survivor activists were actually on the ground level of drafting and writing those rules, and really also put schools in the position of having to often be complicit in sexual violence that was happening on their campuses because they were not legally obligated or required to not respond to certain instances of violence per the Trump administration's Title IX rules. We'll talk more about that later, but just to give you that framework to think about it. Over the last few years, I know, something that we do in Know Your Nine is not only giving technical assistance to folks who are trying to figure out what the status of Title IX is at their school, but also, wanting to be really active in Title IX advocacy and organizing as well. And so we have done a lot of advocacy over the last few years, not only to hold the Trump administration accountable, but also to hold the Biden administration accountable to releasing new rules to really make sure that survivors have the protections that they deserve and to really interrupt the harm that so many folks were experiencing with the Trump administration's Title IX rules in place. And so you'll see that reflected in this timeline here. I'm not going to read all of it for the sake of time, but the TLDR short version of the story is that after a lot of advocacy and pushing from student activists, from advocates, from civil rights lawyers who are experts in Title IX, from teachers and parents, we got a final new Title IX rule that was released. And that new rule, as Elle mentioned earlier, went into effect August 1st of 2024. And so we are now operating in a sort of new landscape where, because of some legal challenges, we have some schools that are still operating under the Trump administration's rules. And then we have some schools and states that are operating under these new rules from the Biden administration. And we'll do a deep dive into what all that looks like in just a little bit. So as I was saying, and some of you, if you've been around and in this space and tracking Title IX over the last few years, you might be familiar with someone named Betsy DeVos. She was the Secretary of Education for the Trump administration and is really credited with a lot of the rolling back of civil rights protections for students and survivors across the country. And she really first did that by rescinding existing Obama-era guidance on Title IX that, as I said before, really clarified what those protections were and what schools' requirements were to respond to sexual violence and harassment. And so since August 14th, 2020, up until August of this past year, 2024, we have had the Trump administration's Title IX rule in place, right? And so that is a long time. That's a whole high school student or college student's high school or college career, right, under these new rules. And it had a really massive impact on students' ability to engage in school. And, as I said before, often because of the way the requirements panned out, made schools really complicit in enabling sexual violence that was happening on campuses. And I think that this quote from my colleague at the Law Center really sums it up. And some things to highlight there are just the way that the Trump rule required schools to ignore many reports and also put survivors through uniquely unfair and burdensome investigations that are actually not required for any other type of student or staff misconduct, right? So the key thing to note there is there was sort of this exceptionalism standard, this higher level of scrutiny for survivors and for folks reporting under Title IX in comparison to other types of misconduct that was happening in schools. And plainly stated, the Trump rule really relied, and I mentioned this earlier in terms of who was involved in drafting these regs, relied on anti-survivor tropes and stereotypes that really assume that reports of harassment and violence are somehow less credible or need to have more scrutiny, right, in order to be taken seriously. And so I think this is really important to note because it really shows how a broader culture, broader rape culture, broader misogyny, and anti-survivor sentiments can really have a huge impact in terms of policy change, right? And what we are seeing in terms of these really crucial federal regulations, that while the 37 words of the statute has never changed, each presidential administration has the opportunity to, issue guidance and these rules to talk about and interpret what that actually looks like, what those 37 words mean in practice. And so it's really important to track, the ways that these anti-survivor attitudes and culture are also making their way into really important policy that has a very direct impact on student survivors' lives. So now that we have that background on the Trump administration's rule, really huge victory for folks that are in the survivor activist and advocacy community, was having these new rules from the Biden administration finally released in April of 2024. And these Title IX changes, as I mentioned earlier, really restored a lot of protections, even though we weren't, there's always, you win some, you lose some. There were definitely some things that we still would love to see be a little bit different, but overall, it was a huge win. It restored protections for student survivors, LGBTQ students, and also pregnant parenting students. And so now that you have that background and have an understanding of sort of what some of the broad picture differences between the Trump rule and the Biden rule are, I know we at Know Your Nine have often hear from students who are entering this 2024-25 school year, returning to campuses and going, wow, there's been a lot of back and forth with Title IX over the last few years. What is actually going on right now, right? What is the status of Title IX currently? So just to give you some fast facts to make sure we're all on the same page. As of August 1st, both K-12 schools and colleges in 24 states, DC and Puerto Rico, are legally required to change their Title IX policies from the Trump rule to the Biden Title IX rule, right? And in just a minute, I'll unpack even more the key differences between those two rules and what they mean specifically for students' rights. But even with this big victory in place, we know that, the anti-survivor advocates, right, the folks that are really seeking to undermine survivors' rights are still going to be out there and advocating too, right? And so we have also really seen a lot of Title IX legal challenges, specifically legal challenges to the Biden administration's new rule. We were expecting this, but it has definitely been eye-opening to see just the extent to which it's been occurring. And so we have 26 states, unfortunately, that have joined lawsuits challenging the new Title IX rule. And that really means that, we know that lawsuits and the words like injunctions or stays, those can get really legal jargony. And so just to really break it down and make it easy for non-lawyer folks like myself to understand, schools in those states that are enjoined, have joined the lawsuits, are not required to comply with the Biden administration's new Title IX rules. And in addition to that, to make things even a little messier, there's a court case that ruled also that hundreds of additional schools are not required to comply. And I'm going to give you all a link in a few minutes that will let you sort of have a better understanding and check for yourselves about what the status of your school is, which state you're in, whether it's a Trump rule state or a Biden rule state. But that's just something to be aware of, is that we do not currently have a uniform experience with Title IX across the country right now. And with all that in mind, the other thing that I really want to underscore, if you leave this training with one new piece of information, maybe this is it, which is that Title IX is the floor, right? Not the ceiling. Title IX is the bare minimum of what schools should be doing to address sexual violence in schools, in K-12 schools, in institutions of higher education. And schools can and should go beyond what Title IX legally requires them to do to support students. And so later in the training, we'll talk a little bit about some ways that you all, if you're interested, can hold your own schools accountable to supporting students, even when things are really messy, as I've been talking about with Title IX. So before we get into sort of like what might be some options when you're seeing Title IX issues going on in your community, definitely our bread and butter at Know Your Nine is making sure folks understand what their rights are and understand them in a way that feels accessible and clear. So that is what I'm going to hopefully achieve today. Definitely, please feel free to continue to put things in the chat if something is confusing or you have follow-up questions. So, and also just want to give a shout out to my friends at the National Women's Law Center who have put together some really awesome resources, including this table that I'm going to be going off of and chatting about, sort of highlighting and comparing and contrasting some of these really key changes between the Trump rule and the Biden Title IX rule. So one huge one that we saw that was a change that's going to mean a lot for students is the standard of harassment. And what that really means is that in the Trump rule, we saw that they use language like severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive in terms of the discrimination or harassment that someone is experiencing, and having it have to be so severe for pervasive and objectively offensive that it effectively denied someone's ability to access an educational program or activity. And so with that, the impact on students and school staff that might be experiencing Title IX issues, the burden was really on students to prove that they experienced something bad enough to warrant response from the school. They had to meet this really high standard, and we saw that a lot of students could not, unfortunately, meet that high standard with evidence that they provided. And so then if they couldn't meet that, the school was legally not obligated to respond to their case, right? Under the Biden rule, in contrast, they've shifted that definition and that language to say that schools have to address harassment if it's severe or pervasive, so not and, but or, which again, in being the policy wonk a little bit that I am, it's actually really important. Those and versus or words, right, can make a big difference in terms of the way that it's interpreted. And so severe or pervasive enough that it denies or limits the ability. So not the level of denial, which is really more severe, but even just limiting someone's ability to access education. And so with this change, it really ensures that students who experience all types of harassment and violence, we know that harassment and violence can look a lot of different ways. And there's a spectrum and a range, and all of those experiences are valid and still harmful. And folks deserve support after those varying different experiences. And so folks, along that spectrum will be able to receive resources and protections from their school, no matter if it was something lower level harm, but still harmful and impacting someone's ability to access their education, or something as severe as an act of violence, right? Next one that I would love to talk about is location as it relates to sexual harassment and violence, and how schools are handling that under Title IX. Under the Trump rule, schools were required to address harassment if it occurred within an educational program or activity. And in contrast, the Biden rule requires schools to address off-campus harassment and other discrimination that creates a hostile environment at school. And this one is really big because we know from research and studies and reports from students that a lot of the harassment that students experience occurs off of campus grounds, not actually on school grounds. It might occur, I know I was recently talking to someone who was going to school in the pandemic, right? And, had something happen when folks were not physically on campus together, but then that wasn't covered under the Trump rules, right? And so they were sort of left without resources. That's a really common experience. I've heard it from a lot of folks. And so the Biden rules expansions of schools' requirements to address harassment is that it didn't just occur on school grounds. And that is really crucial for students, given that we know how much of harassment or violence or other sort of discriminatory experiences don't occur physically on school grounds, right? The next one that I would love to talk about is complainant status. And for this one, the Trump rule said that schools must address harassment if the complainant, so by complainant, we mean, survivor or victim, depending on what language you might want to use. The school only had to address harassment if that person who was reporting violence was participating in or trying to participate in school at the time of filing the complaint, right? In contrast, the Biden rule says that schools have to address a complaint of discrimination or harassment if the complainant, the survivor, was participating in or trying to participate in school at the time of the incident. And this may seem like a small change, but it's actually really huge. And this is because we know that a lot of students take some time, right, between when the incident occurs and when they decide to report. There's a lot of factors that go into one's decision to report or not to report, and it's really different for everybody depending on what the situation is, whether they have folks they can trust that they feel like they can tell, and also who they want to report to, right? As I mentioned before, like there's many tools in the toolbox, whether that's, taking more of a legal route or reporting under Title IX. And also, and we really saw this under the Trump administration's rule, folks were having to take a leave of absence from school at disproportionate rates because of schools' lack of response to violence and harassment and lack of requirement to respond to it. And so under the Trump rule, if someone had had an experience with harassment or violence and had to take a leave of absence or drop out of school and then decided, you know what, I really do want to report this, and that was the right timing for them, the school would not be legally obligated to respond to it. And that the reverse would be true under the Biden rule. Someone who had to take a leave of absence from school because of a hostile environment would be able to access those resources and supports under Title IX. And so that really ensures that schools are required to give folks resources, even if they are actively experiencing an interruption to their education because of their experience, the incident that they experienced. Next one that I want to talk about here is related to reporting, which I know is a big conversation happening amongst school staff right now in terms of how to best go about this and approach this. And under the Trump rule, only high-ranking employees were required to notify the Title IX coordinator if they heard about or suspected violence or harassment happening on campus and in their school. And under the Biden rule, in contrast, employees who are not confidential employees, right? So folks who a student could go to and say, hey, this thing happened to me. I need to sort of figure out what I want to do with that information, but knowing that they're confidential and they can sort of have a conversation about that before there has to be a report made. So employees who are not confidential employees will either have to report harassment to the Title IX coordinator or tell the survivor or victim how to contact the Title IX coordinator. One thing about this that is a little bit tricky is that with more employees mandated to report under the Biden rule, sometimes that we know and have observed that sometimes mandatory reporting can have a negative impact on survivors being able to autonomously decide who they tell and when they tell that person. And so that's definitely something that we want to make sure school staff especially are mindful of as they are engaging with a student that is trying to make a Title IX report or has had an experience with sexual violence or harassment. But the good thing about this change in reporting requirements is that it will ensure that students know how to get support under Title IX, right? That anytime someone mentions something or reports something that they've experienced, that school staff is required to say, hey, just in case you are interested or need resources, here's the information for the Title IX coordinator, right? And making sure that folks have that information easily accessible. And also, and we'll dive into this a little bit later too, requiring that supportive measure options are provided to students who experience harassment that is reported as well. And that is a huge one that can really be make or break between someone's ability to continue to stay in school or not get the support that they need to be able to do so. The next one that I want to talk about, and this is one that folks also may be aware of in terms of just like there's been lots of discussion over the last few years about the actual investigation and Title IX formal process, right? And under the Trump rule, hearing a lot from students that the live cross-examination requirement in a Title IX process was incredibly re-traumatizing. And I know we heard stories from students who literally went through that and then after that experience dropped out of school because they were so re-traumatized by that process. And so, under the Trump rule, following an investigation, schools had to allow the parties' advisors to conduct direct cross-examination at a live hearing. And the change in that policy between that and the Biden rule is that a school has to interview all parties or witnesses through an investigation and or hearing, or allow the parties' advisors to conduct cross-examination at a live hearing. So cross-examination is still an option in circumstances where it might make sense, but it is not a requirement, and that is really good news because there's many situations, there's many Title IX reports where it makes absolutely no sense and is not helpful to anybody to go through a cross-examination experience. And so we're really excited to see that change because we know from what students have told us and advocates have told us and observed over the past 4 years of having the Trump rule in place, just the level of re-traumatization that cross-examination can have. And in the Biden rule, another element of this that they've included is they've outlined trauma-informed buffers to ensure that students don't have to experience that re-traumatization and that all folks can really have access to a fair process. One example of this that I like to mention is that under the Biden rule, one example they give in the text of the guidance of the rule is that if a student does not want to be in the same room as the person who harmed them, but they do need to engage in some sort of cross-examination or more formal hearing process, the school is required to give them technology to be able to participate from a separate room from the person who harmed them. So really great buffers and trauma-informed recommendations there in terms of how a school can conduct a more formal process in a way that is not going to re-traumatize folks. And I promise we're almost done with this more policy wonky nitty-gritty part of the presentation, and then we'll we'll get more into sort of what do we do with all this information, right? Another one, though, that I really want to make sure folks understand is that this difference in standard between the Trump rule and the Biden rule when it comes to responding to complaints and reports. Under the Trump rule, the standard that they set was that schools can't be deliberately indifferent in response to harassment. And this language, I don't know about you all, but every time I see it, it just, again, strikes me as so very unreasonable when we think about, the way that we want schools to be showing care and support for their students. Describing that they have to be just deliberately indifferent is really astounding. And I know a lot of advocates were really shocked and kind of horrified when this language came out. In contrast, the Biden administration's Title IX rule requires schools to take prompt and effective action, right? Definitely much more the language that we want to see folks using when it comes to responding to sexual violence. And they have to take this action in response to harassment or other types of sex-based discrimination. This is also really key because we have heard time and time again from students about the very long waiting times under the Trump administration's rules. And when they were going through a Title IX process, we've literally heard stories of students having to wait years for a complaint to be resolved or the entirety of their college career for something to be resolved under the Trump rules. And as I mentioned earlier, but we'll definitely continue to mention just because of how important supportive measures and accommodations are, this prompt and effective action also requires schools to provide resources, supportive measures, accommodations to students, even if they don't go through a formal process or even if their complaint is dismissed. And this is really key. And I think my next slide, yes, is on supportive measures and accommodations specifically. And I really want to highlight this because I think a lot of folks report to Title IX and don't necessarily know that their school is required to offer them these things. And we've heard time and time again, sometimes folks report to Title IX because they want to go through a formal process and really want to see consequences for the person who harmed them, and that is super valid. And also there are folks that report and say, hey, this was actually an experience that I had with a friend of mine. We know that a lot of violence, intimate partner violence or sexual violence, can actually happen with someone we know. And so sometimes it's actually less about the consequences for folks. Definitely accountability is still a part of that, but also more so sometimes folks report just to be able to get these supportive measures or accommodations, to be able to get things on this slide, like being able to retake classes if their academic performance was negatively impacted because of their experience with violence or harassment. Free mental health support is a huge one. We know, as I mentioned earlier, just the mental health impact that sexual violence and harassment can have on folks. Extensions on deadlines is another big one, or even modification of class schedules. And then another one just that's helpful to mention at the college level, we've also seen and heard students successfully ask their school, hey, I'm living on the same floor as someone who harmed me, and I don't feel safe living here anymore, and I need to be able to have a dorm switch, right, or a housing switch. And that's another one, a supportive measure that the school should help you do and to the best of their ability if it's right for you. So with these, definitely encourage folks. This is a short list of different options, but really encourage folks when they're thinking about supportive measures that they want to ask their school about under Title IX to really dream big and get creative and not limit themselves. Every situation is different and everybody's needs are different in terms of what they need to feel supported and be able to stay in school and continue their education. And so, yeah, really encourage folks to think creatively about what you might need if you're in a situation where you're reporting and asking for these supportive measures. So that was a really big deep dive, but in case you zoned out for any of that or just want a little bit of a recap, in summary, under the Biden administration's Title IX rules, you have the right to a prompt, effective, and equitable Title IX process. That includes either a fair formal investigation or some sort of informal resolution, depending on the situation. You also have the right to support after experiencing sexual harassment or violence, even if it's off campus, as I was talking about earlier, in terms of that change in policy. If you were experiencing a hostile environment after returning from a study abroad program, that's also a new thing, is that schools, even if something is happening outside the United States, which Title IX doesn't apply outside the US, if a student is coming back and still experiencing negative effects from an experience of sexual violence or harassment abroad, the school is still legally required, if they report it to them, to give them supportive measures. Another big one is regular training for employees yearly on how to recognize, report, and respond to sex discrimination. We know this is really huge because, it's key for employees and school staff to be able to respond effectively and in a survivor-centered and trauma-informed way when folks are reporting. Another big one is to not have folks have the right under the new Title IX rules to not have any personally identifiable information disclosed in a Title IX process. And the last one, as I've mentioned several times now, is to receive those supportive measures and accommodations after reporting either harassment or violence. And that is true even if you don't end up going through a formal complaint process or your complaint is dismissed. So we've now had a little bit of a breakdown on, I'm just checking the chat, breakdown on the differences between those new rules. And I'm actually seeing two questions that are specific to the rule changes that I'm actually just going to quickly address now because I think they're both really great. Catherine asked, is there measurable times for prompt and effective action? That is a super great question, Catherine. If my memory serves me, I believe that the Biden administration's rules define that as acting within 60 days of receiving a report. But I can double check that and make sure I'm remembering that correctly. And so that is definitely, I think we were hoping that it would be a little bit shorter than that, but we also know that that is far and away much better than the year-long timelines that we were hearing and seeing from students under the Trump administration's rules. And then, yeah, exactly, Catherine. Better than it is now, for sure. And then someone else asked, does the new Title IX regulation talk anything specific about the informal resolution options? Super great question. Yes, they do talk about that. And actually something that they mention is that informal resolutions are allowed, and that can be things like mediation or restorative justice, and that it is allowed except for the situation when it is employee on student sexual harassment or assault in a K-12 setting. And that the logic behind that is just in terms of power dynamics. We know that folks who are minors and who are experiencing harassment or assault from an adult, there's certain processes and requirements in place that really warrant a more formal investigation in that setting. So yes, they do talk about that and outline some of the ways that can look. Okay, awesome. I'm gonna keep moving for the sake of time. Here, actually, let's see. Oops. There we go. So I was talking a little bit about this before, but just want to also underscore that, while the Biden administration new guidelines are really overall very positive for folks, we also know, as I said earlier at the beginning, right, we have a lot of work left to do. And part of that is addressing these state lawsuits that are going on. We have those 26 states that have joined lawsuits challenging the new rule and aren't required to comply with these new Biden administration regulations. And so what that really means is that it's just really important to keep track of how these lawsuits are evolving. I know myself and other advocates in the space are doing our best to do that, even while a lot of them are moving on different timelines, right? But that is going to be our reality for a while because of the way that the courts move slowly, is that we will have this patchwork, unfortunately, of Title IX protections and guidance across the country. Just to flag some of the things that are coming up, if you're curious about what are the grounds for these challenges to the new Title IX rule, a lot of them have to do with gender identity and sexual orientation and folks taking issue with some of the new protections, which I didn't quite have time to cover in the scope of this webinar, but we have lots of resources on that if anybody's interested in terms of the protections for LGBTQ folks. But a lot of the challenges are related to the explicit protections for LGBTQ students and folks under the new Biden rule. And a lot of the issues that they talk about in the new rule are related to bathrooms and locker rooms, making sure folks can access bathrooms and locker rooms that are consistent with their gender identity, making sure that folks have equitable access to sports, and also using and respecting folks' pronouns. And those are all things that are being contested in the courts right now in terms of the protections, right? Folks contesting those protections that are afforded to LGBTQ folks under Title IX and the new Title IX rules. Another one that's come up is the way that the Biden administration's rule talks about abortion access protections. And we know that this is also an issue that is definitely impactful for student survivors and survivors broadly. They have a section in the rule that talks about pregnant and parenting students and is actually for the first time making it much clearer to schools what sorts of protections they need to provide to folks who are pregnant or student parents. And so that's really exciting. And one of the things that they say is that pregnancy or pregnancy-related conditions, that definition includes abortion procedures and care. And so making sure that no one is discriminated against because they have to take some time off school to go access care, things like that. And then also, and this is most relevant to the space that we're currently in, there have been some lawsuits that contest the or challenge the grievance procedures. So, and by grievance procedures, I just mean the Title IX process for when someone reports harassment or violence, right? So, a little throwback to some of those definition changes we talked about in terms of deliberate indifference versus prompt and effective action, or addressing online harassment, for example. Those were things that folks had issues with. And the US Department of Education that creates these new rules, these new Title IX rules, has been really involved in these state challenges, right? And they'd actually petitioned the Supreme Court over the summer to lift the injunction. And by injunction, I just mean basically telling schools that they can't comply with the new Biden rules, hoping that the court would lift the injunction on sections of the rule that aren't being challenged in the court. So basically anything not on this list that you're seeing on the screen. And SCOTUS actually denied that. And so as of right now, that really means that the patchwork of Title IX rules that we're seeing, 26 states versus 24 states, will really stay the same for this foreseeable future. So that was a lot of information that I just threw at you in terms of where we are and the landscape of everything. And I know I would have this question if I were you, which is what can we do with all this, right? What can we do with these really amazing new rules, with just students still recovering and schools still recovering from the harm of the last 4 years of the Trump administration's rules? And then, what can we do locally? How can we engage in these fights that are happening? How can we make sure that student survivors' rights under Title IX are protected and that folks can get the support that they need? The first thing that I would recommend, and I can actually quickly put this link in the chat, is to check the status of your state and your school on the website of the Department of Education. They have, if you scroll down to the bottom of that link that I just put there, they have a list of the different states that are covered under the Trump rules and held up through the lawsuits versus states that are covered under the Biden rules. And so that's just a really important thing to understand first, depending on where you are. And then in that, they also have a list of, it's unfortunately hundreds of schools at this point that in one court case were also declared exempt from complying with the new Title IX rules. So in addition to checking what state you're in, you also want to check whether, if you're a student or a school employee or a parent who has a kid in school, whether your school is on that list as well. So that's thing number one, just to get a sense of what's going on in your local area. And then thing number two is, and I mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate, we know that Title IX gives the bare minimum, right, that schools should be doing to comply with Title IX at a federal level, to not get in trouble with the federal government, right, and to show their care and support for students. And so with all of this in mind, I would love to now talk with you all about some ways that we can hold schools accountable, right? We can make sure that in states where they are required to be complying with the Biden rule, that they are making those policy changes and following those guidelines and really supporting students under these new rules. And in states or in schools where we don't have these Biden rules in place, where we're still under the Trump regulations, that we're really working and advocating to hold schools accountable and making sure that they are going above and beyond the bare minimum of the Trump rule requirements in ways that are still absolutely and completely legal too. And so before I dive into even more specifics about it, I do want to highlight how the power of student organizing and advocacy more broadly factors into this. I really think of policy, so like these Title IX policy changes that we've really been diving into tonight, and student organizing and activism as two sides of the same coin, right? We wouldn't have all the policy changes and wins, right, for student survivors that we have at the federal, local, or state level without folks really advocating and pushing for them. And so that is really, really crucial. And so, yeah, just want to make sure we're grounded in the fact that over the decades that Title IX has existed, the reason why it's evolved and become much more effective is because student organizing has happened. And that has really been the tipping point a lot of the time at which different government agencies and schools have really taken action to protect students. These are just some brainstormed ideas of ways that KnowYourIX and our network have taken action in the past to really try to hold schools accountable and push for policy changes that are going to support survivors. That can look like, and this is a really great place to start if you are not sure what your Title IX policies are in your school. try to get a meeting with your school principal, your school official, your dean, even your Title IX coordinator, even just a supportive person on your school's like mental health and wellness staff. I know that was true for me when I was in college. I had an ally in the mental health and wellness department at my college, and she was really helpful at helping me figure out sort of like what were the Title IX policies in place and how I might be able to advocate with our Title IX coordinator to get some of those changes made that survivors really needed. So that's thing number one that I would suggest. And then once you've had a chance to sort of figure out what your Title IX policy is and what changes, what might not be working, right? What might not be serving survivors and students. Some other tactics that you can engage with are drafting petitions and getting signatures, organizing rallies, right? To push for these changes and show broad support in your community for them. And also writing op-eds and engaging the press. We know that a lot of the time, and we've seen this at the federal level in terms of what, press engagement and press coverage has been really helpful to put the pressure on when folks may not be necessarily as excited about change as students and advocates are. So that's another one to think about. And yeah, just if you take anything away from this section, really underscoring that students' direct actions result in direct tangible change and strategy results in direct tangible change. So with that in mind, I think something that we think about also as we're thinking about what advocacy might look like and what it might look like to hold schools accountable, shifting away from compliance, right? Making sure that folks are, and of course we want to make sure that at the bare minimum schools are complying with Title IX, right? But shifting the framework from just compliance to also what does caring and supporting student survivors look like, right? And so sometimes just bare minimum compliance is actually not at the level of care. In fact, more often than not, it's not at the level of care that we would really like to see for student survivors. And so even if folks are in compliance, there may still be lots of situations where students are experiencing those negative impacts that I mentioned earlier that we found in research and reports and experiencing those negative impacts after experiencing violence. So just want to provide that framework as another tool in the toolbox to think about these changes. And as folks are also sort of thinking about, okay, I have all this information, I have the background of sort of like where we've been in terms of Title IX and what these new Biden rules mean for students' rights, you might be wondering where you're going to find this policy, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, it actually can be a little bit hard to find. It shouldn't be. In fact, if it is difficult to find, that could indicate a violation of Title IX. Schools are required to post on their school websites their updated Title IX policies. And I know, because the Biden rules went into effect August 1st, if you are in a state or at a school that is covered by the Biden rules, they should already have those policies in effect and be able to show them to you. They should be easily findable. So that's definitely important to know. But you should be able to go to your school's website and find this policy very easily. If you can't and you want to email me and get some support with that, you're more than welcome to. That's something we often do, is provide technical assistance with folks to just try to figure out what actually are the rules in place at my school. But yes, definitely encourage folks to try to go find your policy and see where that leads you. And then something else, once you've found that policy, right, you want to really identify what are the issues. So what am I seeing in my policy, in my school's policy, and looking at, okay, well, given what Emma said, right, about what's in the new Title IX rules, is what's in my school policy written out aligned with what is currently required under Title IX? Are those things in alignment with each other? And this is also something that we are totally happy to help you out with if you'd like support with that. And sometimes it's also important to, and we have these resources on our website as well in terms of things that might be red flags, things that might indicate violations of Title IX, or, areas for growth, right, in terms of what the school could be doing to better support survivors. And then something else that is a helpful framework to think about this is when you're reading the school policy and you've identified what it says, also talking to students in your community, talking to your fellow advocates, your fellow teachers, and trying to figure out what is happening in practice. Oftentimes we will hear from students that while the policy might say one thing, right, that's actually not happening in practice when a student goes to report sexual violence or harassment. And so finding that gap, right, between what is written and what is occurring is really crucial to then turning those things into demands for change, right? Asks for change of your school or of your children's school, right? And then from that gap, right, once you've identified, okay, this thing is written in the policy, but it's actually really not happening, and so students are having negative experiences with reporting and getting support under Title IX, that's where your demands come from for change, right? And thinking about, are those demands going to be things that are going to have a tangible, direct impact on folks' lived experiences? Are they things that, your school is actually able to achieve, right? If they're legal, if they're actionable from the person that you're asking to make these changes. We actually have a whole organizing 101 training that really dives even more deeply into this, but for the sake of time tonight, didn't have time to jump into all of that, but we do have an organizing toolkit if folks are interested in doing more advocacy work around this. And I can put the link to that in the chat as well. And yeah, if you are interested based on what you heard tonight and identifying sort of what's going on locally for you in terms of Title IX and issues that might be arising, would definitely encourage you to check out our organizing toolkit to sort of guide you through that process. And I will actually just put the link to that in the chat now. But okay, here we go. Yeah, so these are just some things to think about when you are doing your own deep dive with this knowledge in mind into what's going on at the local level, which I think is even more important these days, given just how different your Title IX landscape might look like depending on what state you live in and what's going on locally. So organizing is one way that you can, and advocating is one way that you can hold your school accountable to these Title IX changes. But another key way is more of a legal route, but is actually quite accessible or is meant to be quite accessible to folks. And that is filing a complaint with the US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And just to back up a little bit, we have these new Title IX rules in place, and the Department of Education has been tasked with creating new guidelines, right? Which every presidential administration has the opportunity to do. But then also they have been tasked with enforcing these new Title IX rules and Title IX broadly to make sure that schools are complying with them, right? And so in addition to this sort of policy writing arm of the Department of Education, they also have an enforcement arm that will conduct investigations into schools that can receive complaints, which we're going to talk about in a second. And, if they do an investigation and find that there's violations within a school of Title IX, it can make a big difference in, they then have the ability to ask the school to make changes to its policy, to shift the culture at the school around responding to sexual violence. And we've heard from students that have had experiences of the Department of Education investigating their school that it has made a big difference in terms of schools responding promptly and effectively. And part of this is that if a school does not remedy and fix the fact that they're out of compliance with Title IX, they risk losing their federal funding. And so that is sort of the ultimate consequence for not complying with Title IX and can be a really big deal for schools to have that happen. So with that background in mind, if you think that your school is in violation of Title IX, and again, happy to be a resource to help you figure that out, or if you believe that you as a student or a school staff member have been discriminated against by your school, one option is you can file a complaint with the US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR as we call it for short. And just to be clear, a complaint is not the same thing as a lawsuit. They're two distinct, and you can consult a lawyer to file a complaint. We definitely have many Title IX lawyers out there across the country that are great at supporting folks in doing this, but it's not required. You can absolutely do so on your own, and there is a form on the Department of Education's website that makes it really easily accessible to be able to fill it out yourself. And a complaint, in terms of just the impact that it can have, it can help address your specific situation, or it can also help remedy discrimination that might be happening for students, not just you as a student at the school, but for students across the school environment. So we are also very happy to chat with folks if you are interested in filing a complaint. And we actually have this complaint filing guide that if folks are interested in going that route, you can definitely take a look at that. And it really walks you through the process of filing a complaint and what that might look like. So that is another more legally oriented, but generally speaking, a relatively easy lift to be able to hold your school accountable if there's been a Title IX violation. One thing to flag, and there's a lot more detail about this in the guide that I just shared in the chat, but it does sometimes take years for the US Department of Education to resolve a complaint and open it. And also, just because you filed a complaint doesn't necessarily mean there will result in an investigation. So that is just something to think about in terms of, this is not a solution that is a short-term solution, right? It can sort of be more of a long game solution, but is definitely still a helpful tool in the toolbox to hold schools accountable and also make sure that long-term, schools are handling reports of violence in a prompt and effective and responsible way for generations of students to come at the school, right? So with that, we've talked a lot about what these policy changes are. We've talked a lot about, how you might be able to take action, some options. And I just want to leave you with some questions. And I'm also happy to, I know we're about to shift into sort of Q&A and discussion mode potentially, but wanted to just leave you with some questions about to consider as you're sort of digesting all this information and thinking about what it means for you at the local level. So as I mentioned before, thinking about what is your school's Title IX policy, doing some sleuthing to try to figure out what that looks like, and also determining where are issues that are coming up with Title IX, who is raising them and who is taking them in, right? Who are the folks who are decision makers in your school community, who should be who you should be discussing these Title IX issues with. And that can also really help you figure out who are your targets, right, for your asks if you're going to be engaging in more advocacy work around this, and where these conversations need to happen, where you need to start, right? The other thing to think about, and this really would encourage folks to, as students, talk to your fellow students about what they've experienced, right? And just get a sense of like what's been going on with folks for the last 4 years under the Trump rules. And then also, and this is something that we at Know Your Nine are really trying to get a better sense of as well, what is students' experiences this fall with these new rules in place? What does that transition look like? Are those rule changes going smoothly? Are there issues showing up? And so getting a sense of just like what are the resources and policies and procedures in place that already exist for student survivors at your school, sort of auditing that and making sure that you're talking to folks about what their experiences are, because everybody's experience is different, right? And then, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about that gap between what are the resources that exist, what are the policies that exist, and what is happening in practice, and letting that gap really inform what are your asks, what are your hopes in terms of changes that need to be made to really ensure that student survivors are being supported under Title IX. And then the last thing that I would encourage you to consider is, how have changes been made at your school in the past? Have there been existing advocacy efforts or Title IX issues that have come up at your school? I would definitely encourage a quick Google search if you haven't done that already. If you aren't sure really like what your school's history is when it comes to Title IX issues, if there's been any major issues in the past and the press has reported on them, it can be really helpful to just read those news articles to get a sense of like what issues have come up in the past. Is this an ongoing thing? Did it get resolved? Are there folks from, who graduated a while ago who I could still, find and talk to about what their experience was advocating at the school for these changes? And that can really be really helpful just to make sure that folks have a good sense of what the history of the school's experience and either potential violations of Title IX have been. And that can also really inform sort of what strategy you take with advocating for these changes. And with that, that is all the content that I have for you all tonight. And I hope that you took away some helpful information about Title IX from this training. Definitely very open to any and all questions that you have. And, either now during our Q&A portion, or if you want to email me later, my email's up there on the screen, as well as if you want to reach our team more broadly, you can always DM us on Instagram or go to knowyour9.org, where we have a lot of the resources that I mentioned on today's training listed there for you to reference later. So thank you all so much.
Thanks everybody for joining. And, I know I learned a lot. So thank you so much, Emma. I'm going to put in our chat the Shatter the Red Zone Summit that we had 2 weeks ago. We talk about different issues surrounding consent, bystander intervention. We did talk about Title IX, and we talked about rape culture, specifically how it impacts the Greek life community. So it was a really awesome event with a lot of really amazing panelists. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you have the chance. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your night.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Bye, guys.